emails on Thursday night, and if we can't get to them all, we only have so many hours to do that, so we typically will just answer the emails in the order you receive them. So if you email at, Friday morning, it's possible we might not get to it because of other things going on. So the earlier you ask questions, the more likely we are to get back to you. But I encourage you to ask any questions that you might have. Also, Dr. Bean and I will both be here in the lecture for your midterms. So if you have questions for the exam, we'll both be here to answer those questions. So any questions about the midterm process or anything like that? It's same as last time coming in. You'll have a couple of different versions of the exam. You'll have the full hour in order to do the exam. So everything should be things you're not tested on yet. But keep in mind the final exam is cumulative, so it'll have all parts of the course in there, so you'll have to don't just forget about everything. You'll have to come back to that later. Final will be, I think it's 60% on new material, and then 40% on material that are on so it's cumulative. All right, so that's all the questions on midterm. I know you guys are a little late. Yeah, if you have any questions, just let me know, and we can jump in. All right, so I mentioned that today's lecture is fair game. We're going to get into our next phyla, which is the mollusca. This is one of the largest animal phyla. I think it's actually the second largest by the number of species. You see 93,000 species, so we're like around 100,000 different species of mollusks. This includes a very, very diverse group: the snails, the bivalves, and cephalopods, as well as a few other smaller groups that we'll mention. We're down here on our phylogenetic tree. We're working our way through the Lophotrochozoa. Remember, these are all protostomes. They're all bilaterally symmetrical animal. So we're going to continue along there. And just looking at some of the pictures, you can see that this is one of the most beautiful and interesting groups of animals ever. And I usually say this is my favorite group, although I may say that again. But you got clams and mussels, scallops, all kinds of different snails and slugs, and of course the really interesting cephalopods, the squid, the octopus, the nautilus, Alright, so where are we going? Some more nice pictures. If you're walking down the beach and you collect shells, you're definitely going to be picking up mainly bivalve or gastropod shells, so mollusk shells. You can just imagine how many species you can just find on a beach. Think about how many more there are that you can catch. Tons of the most beautiful things you're going to find on the beach are like snails. And these are planktons, we'll talk about those. Lots of these shellless snails, the nudibranchs that we've seen in previous lectures. Big snails, and of course there's an octopus there. Incredibly diverse group. I would think that if you ask the average biology student starting out, if all these animals were in the same phylum, they would say no. And I would agree, because they don't look anything alike. But they are all classified as mollusks. So we're going to talk about what the common features of this group are, why they're all closely related, and then of course we're going to focus in on some of their more specific characteristics for each of the subgroups. So mollusca, or mollusk, means soft body. So these are considered soft bodied animals. But of course, many of them have an outer shell, or a protective shell. All right, so most we're going to see that, but some groups have lost their shell. We saw with the squid, only have like a remnant of a shell, that pen apparatus they have. Think about most snails have shells, but then we have slugs and nudibranchs that don't. But for the most part, there's a shell, or there was a shell at least in some place. So you got the squid, the slugs, and the octopus have of course lost most, if not all, of their shell. The group overall, triploblastic, like all the groups we've been talking about recently, bilaterally symmetrical, and they are coelomates. So true coelom in this group, like we saw last lecture in a couple of groups there. Most of them are marine, but there are lots of freshwater and terrestrial species, especially snails. There are some freshwater bivalves too, some like freshwater clams and mussels too. But most of what we're going to talk about are marine animals. The cephalopods are entirely marine. So this is a very large and diverse group. And so what we're going to do is start with how your textbook approaches this, which is to talk about what the ancestral mollusks probably look like, and then how each of the current groups have evolved to be slightly different from them. Okay. So within the in the phylum, there's actually 7 classes. We're not going to talk about all of these for this course, but I just wanted to mention them just so you know what they are. The first one is the Scaphopoda. These are the tusk shells. So you might have seen something like this on a beach. It looks like a little elephant tusk, a little tiny little shell here. And inside lives an animal kind of like a snail, but in this like tubular type shell. So that's the tusk shells, or the Scaphopoda. So I've seen a few of these on beaches every once in a while, not too common. This one I've never seen before, the Placophora. So I couldn't even describe to you what it's like, but that's a different class. We will get into that one much. The next group is called the Polyplacophora. These are commonly called chitons, which you've probably seen before, but maybe didn't notice them. They're very good at camouflage. Often they're just attached to rocks along the seashore. They kind of look like snails, but they have a divided shell. So they're not quite the same as snails, but they're similar. Those are the Polyplacophora, or the chitons. There's also a monoplacophora, so a single shell. The shell's not divided. It's sort of like a little flat dome. So also kind of resembles a snail, kind of. A little bit more basic in its structure. Gastropods are the snails and the slugs. So it's a very, very diverse and numerous group. Then we have the bivalves. Here's a scallop before you cook it and after, right? And so a really interesting group. We would have looked at the clam up close and personal last week in lab. So that includes the clams, mussels, oysters, and scallops. And then finally that cephalopod group, which is a very advanced and very specialized group, which includes the octopus, squid, nautilus, and cuttlefish. So we don't have time to go through all of these groups. We're going to scratch the surface on a few, talk about some general characteristics. We're only going to talk about these 4 that are highlighted. So for any exam purposes or anything, that's the 4 that you would need to know. So we got the Polyplacophorans, the chitons, the gastropods, that's the snails and slugs, the bivalves, and the cephalopods. Today we'll get through some of those, but not all. So whatever we get to by the end of today's lecture will be what's fair game for your exam. So when we get to the end, I'll mention what slide you have to know of. Okay, this is a pretty long lecture, so it goes into 2 different lecture groups. All right, so let's start by thinking about this group as a whole. What are the characteristics that sort of are shared amongst the group, and then how have each of the groups specialized from that sort of shared sort of concept of what a mollusk is? And that's not an easy thing to do. So your textbook has this image, which is the generalized body plan for a mollusk. If you look at it, it kind of looks like a snail. Snails usually have a twisted shell, so it's not exactly like a snail, but in a lot of ways it's very similar to snails' sort of body. So what I want to do is instead of focus on all the little parts, because we can talk about each of the real mollusk subgroups and talk about their parts later. What I want to talk about here is the sort of generalized parts that we see throughout the groups. And so the 3 things that are in boxes here, the foot, the visceral mass, and the mantle, are things we are going to see across the board in all the groups. So they're like the common characteristics of mollusks. Now, they look different, or maybe in different places in all the groups, but generally speaking, we see these 3 parts in the different groups as we go. So if you think about your clam and your squid last week, they both had a visceral mass, which was essentially where their internal organs are housed. They both had a foot, even though they didn't look the same. The clam had that foot they can extend out of the shell, and the squid obviously has its tentacles and arms, which are a very highly modified, specialized foot. And then they both had a mantle. the mantles look very different in the two. The squid, it was the entire body wall formed the mantle, but in the clam, it was like this paper thin inner lining of the shell that was the mantle tissue. The mantle is what secretes that shell. So in this image, you see a mantle along the inside of the shell here. You see a foot down here. And then the visceral mass is kind of like this, all the innards essentially of the animal that sort of houses all of the different parts. So that's the three things I want you to focus on at this point in the lecture. But I'll point out a couple of other things because they're sort of common things you would expect to see to some degree in the different mollusk groups. So you see there's a nervous system, the yellow here. You got nerve cords running down. We talked about nervous systems in other groups so far. So far they'd be pretty simplistic. And for most of the mollusks, it's pretty simplistic as well, but you start to see a little bit more specialization. So you can see this ring here is like essentially like a clustering of nervous tissue in, it's hard to say head end, but some of these animals have what you would call a head. So you kind of see a clustering of some nervous tissue in the head end. Most of the mollusks we're going to see pretty basic nervous system, but when we get to the cephalopods, we go into one of the most advanced nervous systems of any animal. So this group really has a big spectrum of nervous systems, basic to very, very specialized in the cephalopods. What else do we see? We see a gill here. You saw that in your clam and in your squid last week. You would also see them inside of the sort of the mantle cavity, this open space within the snail. And so this ancestral generalized clam includes a gill. We'll talk about some variations on that as we go. You also see a complete digestive tract going from mouth all the way through different parts to the anus. So we have like a complete alimentary canal going from one end to the other. That is the general way that the mollusks have their digestive systems. So there's some other parts in here. The other thing I wanted to mention was many of the mollusks actually also have this thing called a radula, which we'll come back to when we start talking about some of the subgroups. The radula is like a raspy tongue, if you will. It's kind of like a piece of tissue with like a keratinized, kind of like the material of your fingernails, sort of a rough keratinized surface. And what some mollusks do, think of it like a snail, a lot of them will graze on algae, so they'll sort of rasp away at plants or algae and break that down and then eat that material. So radulas are kind of common in some of the groups, but as we'll talk about, not necessarily in all of the groups. So this is what your textbook would want you to believe the sort of, if there was an ancestral body plan for the group, it would be something like this. And then all of those 7 subclasses have evolved from that to have their own specialized individual plans and structures. Question? No, just know the basic general ideas. I had a couple questions in the last class about labeling. This midterm, I won't have anything about labeling for my questions, but I might ask you about parts. What's the visceral mass for? What's the foot for? What's the mantle for?
Did you bring the pictures and say what species like this?
No, I won't have anything like that. I think I was looking at one of the questions I might put on is a picture of something, but then I tell you what it is. So it's more just for fun. So don't worry too much about it. If you have more questions, just let me know. Okay, so generalized idea here, not a real animal. You got this ancestral body plan, and then all of the groups that we have are modifications of that. So the gastropods, the snails and slugs, most of the members of the group, their body goes through this twisting during development called torsion, and their shell is also twisted. So in many cases. So you know when you look at a snail, you can have that sort of spirally look. It's not all species have that, and obviously the slugs that don't have shells, you don't see that. But generally speaking, this group has this torsion body plan. The Polyplacophora, the chitons, they've taken the shell, and instead of one shell, they've divided it into 8 plates. And then the shell can flex, they can sort of bend a little bit. So I would say this group is pretty close to this ancestral sort of look, but it's got the 8 divisions to the plate instead of one. The cephalopods, completely different. They've pretty much lost their shell for most of the group. There's a couple exceptions. They've taken their foot and created an incredibly highly advanced set of tentacles and arms. We call that the lobe foot. Their head becomes very specialized and developed, unlike most of the members of the group. And like I said, most of the members of the group have either a reduced or lost shell. So definitely different for that subgroup. Bivalves took this sort of basic plan, and instead of having one shell on the top, they created a second shell. So they have 2 valves, bivalve, 2-shelled animals, so they can open and close their 2 shells or valves with that hinge. So you saw that with the plan. And then the scaphopoda, the tusk shells, they've kind of made that shell into like a circle tube that the animal can live inside. So it's hard to say like what an average mollusk is because each group is different, but that's sort of the way we're going to go about it. We have the 3 main parts: the foot, visceral mass, and the mantle, and then modifications from that point on in the rest of the group. So as I go through each class, I'll try to point out some of those differences, specializations for you to understand and know. But this is sort of a starting point for the group, because something has to tie all these different groups together as one file. So let's start with, like I said, we're only going to talk about 4 of the subgroups, and then you get into detail. Some of them will be 1 slide, some of them might be 5 or 6. The chitons, we just have 1 slide. This is the Polyplacophora, which I should have put at the top of the slide, so that's this group. Poly, many plates, Polyplacophora. So the Polyplacophorans, they really do look like a snail, but like I said, their shell is divided into 8 pieces, so they're in their own subclass. These animals are really good at attaching themselves to substrates like rocks. And they're really good at camouflage too. They happen to have colorations that usually very closely resemble whatever their background is that they're in. So often they're really hard to see. When I'm looking, I'm not usually looking for these, but when I'm looking in the intertidal zone or looking along the shoreline for anything, animals, what I typically see before I see anything else are these divisions of their shell. So I won't even see the whole animal, I will see these sort of regular divisions and think, well, that pattern is interesting, and then I look back, sort of zoom out of it and realize, oh, there's a chitin there. And so once you see it, they're really obvious, but they're actually pretty good at camouflage. Because their shell can flex, they can really pull themselves down on the rock really completely. And so in my entire life, I've never successfully removed a chitin from a rock, unless I have some form of tool. So if I have a screwdriver or a knife or something, I can wedge like dislodge one, but with my fingers or hands, I can't get them off. It's incredibly strong and really good at clamping down on the rock. So that's really good for if a predator comes along, like a bird or something, that wants to eat them, or a fish or something, they're not going to have very much success. So this group is designed pretty well for its environment. Essentially, they're like little lawnmowers. They have a radula in their mouth area, and so there's the mouth. Remember that ancestral mollusk, the radula is this raspy tongue they have. And what they do is they crawl along like a snail does with their foot, and they scrape algae off the rocks. And that's what they do. So they can just sort of go along, feeding on things right below them. And if a predator comes, they just plant down on the rocks, and they're really safe. So a really, successful body plan for whatever you do. You don't do too much, but that is the chitons or the Polyplacophora. So if you see one of those, now you know what it is. It's a mollusk that's similar in many ways to a snail, but has its own specialized sort of body structure. Any questions about the Polyplacophora? The gastropods are the most numerous of different ones. So you can see about 3/4 of all of the mollusk species are gastropods. So we're talking about 3/4 of about 100,000. So we're talking about 70-something thousand species of gastropods. So that's a lot of gastropod species. And all you have to do is walk down a beach pretty much anywhere, and you'll see many, many, many species of snails. All the different shells you find, probably at least half of them are some form of snail. And the other half are probably bivalves. So lots and lots of different variety here. You can see that in many cases the twisting of the shell into that spirally like form. Not all of them show the spirally form. Some have it, some have lost it over development, or over evolution. And then of course we have our groups of gastropod that have lost their shell altogether. So we have our land slugs and our marine nudibranchs, right? So our shellless marine snails. Obviously they can be pretty small, but then there's giants too. So these two here, you can see they're in the palm of someone's hand. Some are really big. So this is a big land snail, like bigger than your hand kind of thing. This is a big moon snail at the top. I've picked up moon snails where you hold them by the shell and their foot comes out and it's like over a football. Like just absolutely massive snails, pretty big. So all kinds of beautiful, interesting colors, you know, just a spectacular group altogether. Marine habitats, freshwater habitats, even terrestrial habitats. You find gastropods all over the place. Yep.
Would it have a multiple shell make them more resistant?
Yeah, that's a typical, standard thing to think about. But they have a shell, right? So usually that's enough to protect them. I'll tell you some examples of where that may not be the case. But the nudibranchs that are so colorful, often they have incorporated, if you remember back to our previous lectures, either sponge toxins or cnidarian cnidocysts, those firing cells, those nematocyst cells, into their skin. And so they're just like taunting animals to eat them, right? And saying, come and get me. I'm colorful and beautiful, but you can't touch me because I'm so tough and dangerous, right? So that's a great question as to why, but they may be attracting other mates of other species or other things. So that's a good big picture question for like an ecology evolution type of question for sure. So again, most gastropods during development go undergo this process called torsion, where their body wall and visceral mass will twist, and then they will secrete their shell to match their body. So you end up with this twisted shell-like form. Again, I say most. There's 70,000+ species. There's lots of examples where that's not the case, and definitely usually not the case in anything that doesn't have a shell. But generally speaking, the group tends to do this. So that's one of their defining characteristics. Okay. Most have a snail, but then there are a good number of different land and slugs and marine nudibranchs. So very diverse group in amongst itself. Alright, so as far as feeding goes, most members of the gastropods are herbivores. They feed on plant material or algae. And so it doesn't take long. You can go outside and find a slug on a tree or on a leaf or a snail munching down on some sort of vegetation. They're really important grazers in a lot of ecosystems. Definitely in the aquatic environment too. They're usually sort of cruising around, rasping away at plant materials on rocks. They have that radula that we talked about with the chitin for doing that. So most of the gastropods graze like that using their radula. However, there are some species that are highly carnivorous and predatory as far as their appetite goes. And so if you took 192, you may have done a lab where you looked at clam predation by snails. So you see this characteristic hole around the hinge of the bivalve. If you see that clam or whatever bivalve was killed by a snail. And the family of snails that typically does this is the moon snail. So this is the one that I showed you on the previous slide that can be bigger than your hand. Some species are small, but some are really, really big. And so what they do is they'll sort of sneak up behind a clam, they'll jump on top of it. Their radula is modified from the one you typically see into more like a drill-like apparatus. So they can drill through the shell of this clam, creating that hole. And then they can secrete digestive enzymes into the hole, which then kills the clam. And then they can open up the clam once it's dead and then eat the nice, yummy morsel that's inside. So if you go to some beaches, you see many, many, many clams with these little holes. In some ecosystems, these are one of the major predators. And they're very successful, very, very good at this. So we definitely have some really mean, tough snails out there that are carnivorous. And I actually have another video that shows another group that are also very carnivorous. Before I start this, I had to crank the volume on the computer and the speakers here to 100% to even hear it. But in the last hour, I don't know if anything's changed, so we might get a big loud noise. I'll try to stop it as fast as possible. I don't think that will happen, but I just want to warn you in case something happens. I don't know what's wrong with the audio in the room, but I think it'll be normal sound, but just in case it's not. All right. Alright, so this is a carnivorous snail.
Crawling along the ocean floor is a cone snail. It looks harmless, but appearances can be deceiving. 4 tubes jut out from its shell. The long one at the top is a siphon, which it uses to inhale water and detect prey. The smaller ones on either side are its eye stalks, and in the middle, a deadly proboscis. Concealed within the tip is a lethal weapon. A harpoon loaded with a neurotoxic mix so complex there is no antivenom to thwart it. It's armed with at least 100 different toxins, more than any other creature. When some cone snails go hunting, they like to burrow into the sand and wait. When a meal happens by, the cone snail fires its harpoon. The poisons quickly paralyze the fish. Once its prey is helpless, the cone snail retracts it through its proboscis until it engulfs the fish, swallowing it whole. The snail is no longer hungry, and its appearance no longer harmless.
Snail is no longer.
It's a cone snail.
Well, it's pretty full, so it's eating something probably the same
It looks
size. So usually that's what it would be. It would be pretty good for a few days, or would have to eat it. How long would it take to digest? My guess is days. I don't know though, 100%. predator of different fish.
Slash short today.
That group, the cone snails, super common in the Bible. So how many of you have seen one of these before? How many of you have picked up one of these before? Absolutely, right? They're beautiful. So lots of people pick these up off the beach. Every once in a while, though, you gotta make sure that it's dead. So make sure that you're picking up a cone snail that's just empty. Because if it's still alive in there, it could get you. So like an adult is not gonna die from a cone snail bite, although some of them can be like this big, but it's gonna be really nasty what it can do to you. I've heard of children getting stung and then essentially drowning because they freeze with the water and that kind of thing. So they can be really nasty and really dangerous depending on the circle of life. So, but you definitely don't wanna get stung by one. I was showing my 4-year-old last summer a cone snail on the beach, and wouldn't you know it, I pick it up and I look inside, it's alive. So I threw it back in the water, obviously really fast. But I've been picking these up my whole life and I've never found a live one, but that day when I got a 4-year-old, I definitely found it. Question?
I was gonna ask if there are any benefits to the cone snail, because when it eats the fish, right, it was like majority out of its shell, so it looked like very vulnerable for like any kind of predator to eat it.
I think that would be the case for any any mollusk really. If it gets out of its shell, then you've got like a soft part you can maybe pick at. So fish and other birds and things will go after them at that point. So then they gotta get back into their shell as fast as possible. So I would say that any of them will be vulnerable to that kind of thing when they're out, but then that's why they retract back. So a really interesting group, both herbivorous, most of the snails, but then some pretty impressive carnivores out there. They can eat things much larger than them pretty effectively. So those are the cone snails. Something we haven't talked about yet, but which will become more of a common topic for discussion as we go. We're starting to get into animals that are much more complex and larger. And we start talking about things like circulatory systems and respiratory systems. So those are topics we're gonna get into as we go. Today, I'm mentioning here, just sort of in passing, that this group has a circulatory system, the mollusks overall. We're gonna get into more detail about that next lecture when we get to the cephalopods, but in some members of the group, they have a very advanced circulatory system, but they all have at least some circulatory systems. You actually asked a question about that in lab last week. Don't worry too much about it right now, but we'll get into it on Monday, the types of circulatory systems this group has. But I just want to mention that they have a legit circulatory system. They also have a legit respiratory system. And so they have apparatus for obtaining oxygen from their environment. And generally speaking, this goes for most animals. If it's in the water, most likely it's using a gill or something like a gill to get oxygen. And if it's on land, it's not using a gill, right? Because gills don't work so well on land. So most aquatic snails have a gill of some sort. You saw the gills in the clam, you saw the gills of the squid. So it's no surprise that all the members of this group, if they're aquatic, have gills. And the gills are inside of the mantle cavity. So somewhere in the shell, kind of like what you saw in the clam, you've got this furry apparatus that's a gill, and it can absorb oxygen from the water. When it comes to the nudibranchs and the slugs, they obviously don't have a mantle cavity because they don't have a shell. So where and how do they get their oxygen? How do they respire, right? Well, the word nudibranch translates from French. It's actually branchies, nudibranchies. Branchies are the French term for gills. And so essentially they're called naked gills. That's what their sort of original French name is. And so when you look at nudibranchs, their back usually has all kinds of frilly extensions to it to make them look really pretty. But in most cases, all of these extra flaps and folds and all these other things are used as gills. So they essentially use their body wall as a gill. So they can absorb oxygen right through their body wall, these frilly like extensions, into their body. So snails, aquatic snails with a shell will have a gill inside the shell. The nudibranchs that don't have a shell are the aquatic slugs that sometimes we see in freshwater systems. They'll use their body surface as their respiratory organs. And then finally, we have some terrestrial versions of snails too. So if you find a terrestrial snail, they obviously aren't in water. They're gonna use a modified space within their shell as a very simple lump. Okay. So terrestrial snails essentially have an air space within their shell that air can circulate in and around. And their mantle, that sort of tissue that creates the shell, that very thin layer of tissue, can act as a very simple lung, so it can absorb oxygen into the body of the animal. So again, where you live matters as far as how you get oxygen. Most aquatic animals can use a lung or something like, or sorry, a gill or something like it. But when you get out of the water, other animals use different apparatuses. So we see a very simplified lung here. Most of the vertebrates, when we get to us, we obviously have lungs. Some fish have lungs. We'll talk about a couple of other ways that land animals breathe as we get to different groups. With this gastropod group, because it has some terrestrial individuals, could have a very simplified lung, or if they're in water, gills or something like that. So lots of variety of mechanisms or apparatus used for breathing. All right, reproduction in this group. If you can imagine, you can breathe it up, you can find it in the gastropods. Essentially, everything you can imagine, weird as you can imagine, is happening in the gastropod group. So we have lots of species that are hermaphrodites. They will have male and female parts. They could fertilize themselves, or they can produce release gametes that then fertilize. Okay, so lots of individuals can just asexually reproduce if they want, or they can sexually reproduce with other members of their species that are also hermaphrodites. So lots and lots of species have those capabilities. I would say most species of snails do this. They release their gametes into the environment. So usually they're aquatic, so they release the sperm into the environment. They release the eggs into the environment, and then they fertilize what we call externally. It's not inside the animal, but outside. And then the little baby gastropod will develop at that point. So that I would say is, if you had to pick one that's the most standard, it would be this, sexual reproduction externally. But then we have lots of species that can also perform internal fertilization. I'll show you a picture here. In order to fertilize eggs. So this one is pretty weird. Use your imagination. Here's a bunch of sea hares. So these are one type of nudibranch, so shellless marine snail. Not as pretty as the other ones we've seen. And they often get together in these groups for mating. It's kind of like a little party here. And they're hermaphrodites. So essentially all of the members of what's called the mating chain have both male and female parts. So depending on where you are in the chain and who's behind you or who's in front of you, you can act like a male, you can act like a female, you can act like both if you want. And you can internally fertilize or be internally fertilized by your partners. Right? So try explaining this to a child. That's not exactly something I'm looking forward to, but definitely a weird and interesting mechanism or method for reproduction. So we see all kinds of different ways for reproduction here. Internal, external, asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction within the group. So I'm never going to ask you how to make snails mate because there's no real one answer for that question. Okay? They can do it depending on the species. A lot of times you'll see the eggs of snails, though. They're sometimes really obvious if you know what you're looking for. So, if you're looking at, if you're at a marsh and you're walking along a marsh, you'll see some reeds sticking in the water. Often you'll see these things like berries, like colorful little bundles of things. Those are often snail eggs. eggs that are being deposited. So a lot of snails will crawl out of the water and deposit their eggs out of the water so they're away from predators. So that's not that uncommon to see. This one you see a lot in like sandy beaches and areas like that. It looks like an old piece of like a leather shoe or something. It doesn't look like anything, but what this really is millions of really tiny eggs that are sort of glued together in what looks like just like a bunch of sand. So this is really common to see, and all of those little eggs are fertilized and just developing until they hatch. Here's a couple of nudibranchs doing their thing here. The female is releasing eggs into this sort of coily ribbon. They're all attached to one another, and as she does that, the male is releasing sperm. So sometimes you see these really beautiful, colorful batches of eggs, and sometimes they're wrapped around vegetation, or sometimes they're just floating around. But if you look around in the aquatic environment, you'll often see things like this, and those are usually snail eggs. Very common. They're very good at reproducing. All right, so that's the gastropods. That's the largest member of the group. The next group, you could argue, is not as interesting, but maybe more important for humans because it's a very important food source for us. So this is the bivalves. A lot of people get their protein from bivalves, so clams, mussels, oysters, scallops, all edible, all tasty. So I've got a picture here of what they really look like, and then what they look like when they get to the table. So clams, mussels, oysters, and scallops. So lots of nodding, lots of hungry people. Okay. Obviously, this defining characteristic of this group comes from the name bivalve, right? So it's got two valves, little hinge, and that's your clam there that you dissected last week. Very simplified body form. And we already saw a lot of the anatomy in that group. So we'll go through a bit of that as a review, but this is our four major groups of bivalves. Each one has many species of them. Okay. So the shell is divided into two halves. It's kind of lost any like clear head and tail end. It doesn't have that radula that the snails and kites had. It's a different body plan than what we've seen in the other two groups. And they of course have a different feeding style than the chites and gastropods. This group also includes one of my favorite groups of animals, which are the giant clams. Has anybody ever seen giant clams in the wild? Or in an aquarium? Yeah, where were you?
In the Caribbean.
In the Caribbean? Cool. There we go. So these are found in the tropics. Usually if you're around a coral reef or something, you might see these. You know it's a giant clam based on the shape of its shell. So you see these kind of undulating, sort of wavy patterns to the shell. The giant clams have that sort of shell shape. There's many species of giant clams, and the name is pretty accurate. So you can see divers here. Some of these giant clams can be 6 feet across or more, hundreds and hundreds of pounds in size. So really massive giant clams. The most interesting thing about this, and the reason they get their own slide, is because of this coloration you see. So not all of them are as colorful and beautiful, but you can see like some beautiful blues and purples and sometimes greens and oranges, depending on the species. This is actually the mantle of the clam. These species can have it sort of move outwards from inside the shell and cover up part of that external part. So kind of like lips, if you will. I don't know how else to say it. But they can extend their mantle outwards, outside of the shell. So all that colorful part, that sort of soft, velvety looking tissue, is the actual mantle being sort of pushed out. And the reason they do that is because living in their mantle are symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae. So remember that zooxanthellae group we talked about with the corals and the anemones and some of the other cnidarians? That symbiont that lives in the corals, it's an algae, and that algae can photosynthesize and give nutrients to the corals. These giant clams also have that same symbiotic relationship with those types of algae. Different species, so they come in different colors and things like that. But it's the same, essentially the same deal with the giant clams as what we saw with the corals. They give the algae a place to live. They literally live in the skin of their mantle cavity. When it's sunny out, they expose their mantles to the sun. So those zooxanthellae are basking in the sun, and they perform photosynthesis. And then they produce sugars and oxygen. And then the clam can absorb some of those sugars and oxygen in exchange for that place to live. So it's another one of those mutualistic, symbiotic relationships. Beautiful thing. Also, you know, visually beautiful as well, and makes this really pretty special and pretty interesting. They still feed like normal clams as well. They still have their ability to filter. So you can see these holes here. These are, let's see what here? These are their incurrent and excurrent siphons that you saw in the clam in the lab. But they also have this added ability to take advantage of their symbiont to get nutrients too. Is there a question? Zooxanthellae, endosymbiotic algae. So if you look back to your slide on your corals, there's a whole page on those. So it's the same type of algal spool. So that makes this particular group of clams kind of special because they have this symbiont that we can do that. But if we look inside the bivalve, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you had part of your lab last week on it, their anatomy is a bit different from what you would see in a snail, but it has those same parts. It's got a mantle, it's got a foot, it's got visceral mass, it's got gills in there. The things that are different are related to their feeding stones. So they have the incurrent and excurrent siphon. So the incurrent siphon will pull water in from the outside. The water will sort of wash around inside of the clam shell. Any food particles that are in the water will get stuck usually to the gills or some other sticky part of the animal. And then little cilia on the gills and other parts will move the food to the mouth where they can be ingested. And then the food will go through the mouth into the gut and through the digestive system, and then finally come back out at the anus, so they have a full digestive tract there. And then any waste products will get washed out with the excurrent cycle back into the water. So they are considered, you can call them filter feeders or suspension feeders. They're essentially moving water through, filtering it through in order to get the food particles. And so those gills are helping attract the food, but of course the gills are also used for centrifuge too. So again, most of this should be review, although I know in your claims you didn't see all the parts because it's a little hard to see on a dissected animal in the lab, but this will help you see some of the key points. There's even a heart here, which we'll talk about more next week. So good? All right, most of the bivalves lead a very sedentary lifestyle. They're not moving around too much. If you thought the snails and the chitons were slow to move, most of these ones move even less. So most of the oysters, clams, mussels, and scallops, especially as adults, will be very much in one place. The clams like to bury themselves in the sand. These are mussels. So if you go down to the seashore, you'll often find mussels attached to rocks or maybe to a dock pillar or something like that. And if you try to pull one off, you can. It's actually not that hard. They actually attach themselves to the rocks with these little threads. They're called byssal threads. So this mussel will secrete byssal threads to attach themselves to rocks. And they work pretty well. They're good at, keeping them in one place if waves come in and crash. And so they just sort of stay there for their whole life and filter the water and do their thing. Some burrow in the mud, so the clams, most of them, the giant clams are kind of an exception because they just sit on the top. But the giant, or most of the clams will use their foot to pull themselves into the sand. And then they'll extend their siphons up to the surface of the substrate, so the sand or mud. So this, sometimes clams have very long siphons, they can extend up to maybe a foot or more, depending on the species. And so they'll suck water down into the mantle cavity and then back out through the external siphon, and able to feed. So this gives them like a pretty safe place to live. They're under the ground for the most part. They have their shell too. They're just exposing the little tip of their siphon to get to the water.
They don't have a toilet.
They do? Yep. So, there's the mouth, goes all the way through the full digestive tract. So all of these members of this group. So the external siphon and the internal siphon are separate from the digestive tract. They pull water into the clam, the space inside the mantle cavity, and then inside there they have the full digestive tract. It's sort of separate from it. So waste will come out of the anus right here, and then water will be shot out through out of the clam shell nearby, so it'll sort of get washed out. It'll sort of cycle it through. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. The internal and external siphon are not part of the digestive tract. They are separate, like a water. It brings water in and then pushes water out. And then the digestive tract takes up food and processes it and produces waste. So that's a good question and a good point. All right, and some actually can move. So I'm going to show you a kind of a special example of one that can move. Fun video of a little baby scallop. So this is a little baby scallop. You can tell it's a scallop by that little triangular base to it. So it's got that round part of the shell, but then a little triangle at the bottom. Little baby scallops can do this. Once they get too big, they can't do it. So what you're going to see is a diver going to go poking. So you see the size of their finger compared to the scallop. That'll tell you how big the scallop is. So that's kind of fun, right? Swimming scallops, right? You see, it just gets, at some point it just says,
That's horrifying.
but essentially all it's doing is opening and closing its shell, creating a little water jet and pushing water. And it's not really swimming in any direction, it's just hoping it's gonna go away from the predator, whatever it happens. So when they're really tiny, they can do this, but once they get big enough, like a big scallop can be like that big, really strong and hard, so they're pretty tough to predators, pretty hard
Drinking
to-
warm water before bed balances blood sugar levels and
They're pretty robust once they're big enough. It's just a little, it's kind of
That's so creepy. That is actually really creepy.
So, I find these pictures really interesting. So that was a little baby scallop. If you look at a scallop close up, this is kind of what they look like. This isn't a scallop that's sort of facing up at you and the valve is open, so they're able to do the filter feeding thing like the clams do. They typically just sit on the surface of the sand or mud. They don't burrow. But if you look closely, they have all these sort of frilly parts to them. But if you zoom in on these little things, they're actually little eyes, which is kind of cool. So they can actually sense light and detect like a predator, right? And then they can close up. So next time you eat a scallop, I want you to think of those little eyes. All right, so if you didn't think they had feelings, just look at those blue eyes. All right, so we're almost done for the content for today. Just got a couple of minutes left. I want to touch on a couple more things. The bivalves, as far as reproduction goes, a little bit more straightforward than the gastropods. They usually use internal fertilization, and that makes a lot of sense. These are filter feeding animals, right? So they're really good at sucking water in and pushing water out. And so what will happen is the male of the species will release sperm. The sperm will go into the water. Females will then filter the water into the shell, just like they would for feeding. And now the sperm is inside, and then eggs will be inside, and they'll be fertilized. So it's a pretty good way of creating what we call internal fertilization, using a filter essentially to move the sperm. So that's usually what we see. And in most members of this overall phyla, we see indirect development. So it's not that the little baby just becomes an adult right away. They have different developmental phases. And so here's two of the most common phases in this group. This one's the one you need to remember. Remember that this is a member of the Lophotrochozoa. So Lophotrochozoa either have a lophophore or a trochophore larvae. And so members of the mollusks have a trochophore larvae. They don't have a lophophore feeding apparatus. So many of the members of the group will have this little larval phase. It'll be like this for a little while, and then sometimes it'll turn into something called a veliger, which is a different phase. Some even have more phases to their life before they get to the adult stage, but it's definitely not a direct baby to adult. It's an indirect development through different larval phases. And then one more interesting fact about some bivalves is some are actually parasites, which is kind of weird. Not very many species, but a few species of bivalves, their little larval phase, that little juvenile, can be parasitic on fish. So fish will come along trying to eat the adult. They'll release the little larvae into the water. You can see these little tiny little clams floating around. They're different larval phases. And some of the species, the larval phase will get into the gills of the fish and clamp on, literally clamp onto the gills and damage the tissue so they start bleeding. And then they'll suck back the nutrients from the fish's gills. So these are pictures of little tiny clam larvae stuck in the gills of fish. Not that uncommon to find. If you catch a fish and dissect it, if you look really closely in the gills, you see these little brown specks. A lot of times they're these little parasitic juvenile forms of different clam species. So every once in a while you get weird parasitic forms of these things as well as normal. Yeah. The fish is breathing and respiring, so it's sort of sucking water into its mouth. And they suck up these little these little larvae, and then they get stuck in their gills, and they clamp on, and then they just hang out there until they develop into larger individuals, and they release, and then they get sort of left off in the water. Yeah, they do damage. They'll clamp onto the gills. The gills are very soft. That'll damage the tissue. They'll start bleeding into their clams' valves, the mouth, and then they'll absorb the nutrients. All right, we're done. This will be the last slide for the exam. The next slide, in case you're curious, is on cephalopods. So don't worry about cephalopods